and welcome back once again to yet another video. I am really excited because we have been doing a series of shorter videos since we had our major lecture in 3D modeling. That was the 18th video in the series, and for a while now we have been reviewing small techniques and tools that came up during that major lesson, and this one finally is the last one. And so this video is about modifiers. So the modifiers that came up during the 3D modeling workflow were the mirror modifier, the Boolean modifier, and the screw modifier. So we're gonna take a look at each one of them. And if you remember, when I finished the 18th lesson, I was really trying to wrap things up, and I left the valve of the Mocha coffee maker as more of a placeholder. But it just so happened to be the perfect object to demonstrate at the very same time all of the modifiers that we need to review today. So I went ahead and I made it happen. All right, well, first of all, I brought in some reference images. Here we have a technical drawing, a blueprint. Although it's not the specific model that we're interested in, the mechanics are the same. And while we're at it, if you remember in the 18th video, I told you that this is the ideal kind of reference that you want when you are 3D modeling, because when we are in side view, we are in an orthographic mode. And so we are seeing things in their true dimension. There's no perspective involved. Whereas when we have pictures like this one, photos, they are taken from perspective. And so things that are farther away get smaller. And so the dimensions get a little bit messed up depending on which lens we use to take that photo. Anyway, regardless of this detail, I got in some reference images. As you can see, there are many different types of valves. The principle is always the same, even though the details might change slightly. And also, again, this is kind of a for fun project. It's not something that needs to be manufactured. So I'm really not interested in investing time in making the thing ultra realistic or up to some specs. It just needs to be sort of like believable enough. Anyway, enough of me ranting, and let's take a look on what's happening over here. Okay, so let's start from the top. What we have here is a series of connected vertices that make the profile of this part over here, okay? So this is a technique that by now we have reviewed more than a few times. I showed this to you at the beginning of the 18th lecture when I was talking about elegance in 3D modeling, and I kind of demonstrated this approach on the Utah teapot. And I also used a similar approach to 3D model the handle of the coffee maker. So I created for myself a profile, and in the case of the handle, then I kind of duplicated and connected the faces. Whereas in the case of that teapot, I took the same exact approach that I'm taking here, which is that once you have your profile, you want to slap on a subdivision modifier to kind of give it a little bit more detail. And then you can use the screw modifier to revolve it around. And so the first modifier that we will be reviewing is the screw modifier, which by now you know that it revolves things around, right? So you can put in how many degrees of a rotation you want, for example, 180 or a full 360 degrees. But as the name suggests, and also the icon, this is not necessarily the number one use that this one was thought for. In fact, what we have over here is the screw option, which is what creates the vertical displacement, and the iteration is how many times that is repeated. Now, in this specific case, I do not need any more than one iteration, and definitely I don't need any vertical displacement. So I left it as is. The only thing that I change are the steps, which kind of determine the resolution that the revolve has. So I could put in 12 and it would be much more edgy. Or I could put in a much bigger number and it would start to get rounder and rounder as it gets closer to a perfect circle. Now I've chosen 24 because this is kind of the number that I've kept across all of the meshes that make up this valve so that they would be somewhat coherent with each other. However, what I did after, I placed another subdivision modifier to give it a little bit extra detail and smoothness. And so as you can see, if you remember in lesson 14, we reviewed in great detail this modifier. And one of the things that we talked about is the hierarchy of modifiers. So what's happening here is that we have the first subdivision happening, then the screw modifier, and then one additional subdivision that is now acting on the surface that has been created by the screw modifier. Now, what I did below for the thread of the valve is that I instead created for myself a very simple cylinder, the usual Shift A cylinder, and then I kind of like added some edge loops and shrunk it down here at the bottom. Very simple. And then to create the thread around it, I take the same approach that I took here, where I created for myself the profile that I wanted. I added a subdivision modifier to give it a little bit more detail. And in this case, I added 1.5 centimeters of screw, which is what is creating this elevation. And then I created 5 iterations. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so as you can see, you could add as many iterations as you want, and you can play with this to sort of change the ratio of the screw. In this case, 1.5 fits as well. And as you can see, once again, I'm not caring too much to get something that is very realistic, especially because this part won't even be seen in our 3D model. This is just to demonstrate the modifier, but this is pretty much how you go about it, regardless of whether you're trying to create something that only resembles it, like in this case, or when you're trying to actually 3D model something that needs to be manufactured. For example, you could very much use this modifier to create a thread that gets then 3D printed and that is fully functional. Now, one more setting that you might want to know about is the calculate order. So when you use the screw modifier, the smooth shading is kind of enabled by default, but the calculate order is not. And if you don't have it, you might have some artifacts showing up. In this case, they're not, but in case they are, you could click on this and it would help achieve a better visual result. All right, so that is pretty much all that you need to know about the screw modifier. And now let's talk about the other two, the mirror and the Boolean. So what we have here is a treatment of the surface that is very much the same that we are seeing here in the Mocha. In fact, you might probably guess that the design of the Mocha was in fact inspired by this manufacturing process, although I'm taking a wild guess. But regardless, if you remember, during the struggle of figuring out how to 3D model this object, I ended up figuring out that the best way to go about it was to have a Boolean subtraction. And so I did the exact same thing that I did when I was 3D modeling the coffee maker. And that is I created for myself a negative shape like this one that has exactly the kind of shape that basically represents the material that needs to be trimmed off. And I've renamed this one negative. And then in my 3D model, I applied a Boolean modifier. And in the Boolean modifier, I selected difference. I selected the object, and as you can see, that is performing for me the operation of removing that material. Now, if I were to select union, it would kind of merge together in one object the mesh that I have selected and the other one. Whereas if I were to select intersect, it would only keep the intersection of the two. In this case, what we're interested in is the difference. Now, once I have this part, if you remember in lesson 18, I also said that one of the best things that you can do for yourself is to recycle any kind of work that you can recycle. And so since this object is symmetrical on the vertical axis, what I created after is a mirror modifier. Now, you have seen me use this mirror modifier before to mirror in a horizontal sense. In this case, we are mirroring vertically. And so you have to understand that the mirroring takes place starting from the pivot point. So in this case, I lowered the pivot point to the very bottom of it using the same kind of process that I showed you in the 19th video, where I created for myself a point over here, right in the center of the mesh. I brought my 3D cursor over there, and then I moved my origin point over there. And now I can simply turn on the mirror and it will complete for me the process. Now, the mirror modifier, like the Boolean modifier, are pretty straightforward. They don't have too many options. The options that you need to understand about the mirror modifier are clipping and merge. So clipping basically helps you when you have objects that are meeting at the symmetry point, and especially when you're working horizontally and maybe a subdivision modifier is involved. Clipping kind of like allows you to push things to the very edge of the symmetry axis, which can kind of be handy, but sometimes can also get in the way. And so if you feel like you're getting stuck and you cannot longer move a vertex, for example, probably it's because you have clipping enabled and you're right in the middle of the symmetry action. Now, merge, as you have now learned, is the operation of basically taking two things that are overlapping within a threshold and combining them into one. So the merge here has its own tolerance that you can set, and any vertices that are sort of overlapping within this tolerance will be considered as one. Lastly, there is this option, which you might want to use when you are operating in a scenario where you don't have something that is centered. So, for example, if I were to create a cube and I had it way off axis, like over here, and it's not centered in any reasonable way. If I went about the process of mirroring it, it would get mirrored along its pivot point. So in this case, I'm mirroring across the x-axis, so it's showing up over here. However, suppose that for some reason, and once again, it's following the pivot point. So if the pivot point is centered, it's going to show up over here. So suppose that for some reason I needed to mirror it somewhere over here. What I would do is the following. I would press Shift A and create an empty, which is the first time you are encountering it in this series, but is nothing more than an object with nothing inside of it. So if you remember in one of the earliest videos, I told you that if you enter an object in edit mode and kind of delete everything, you end up with an empty object. Well, that is it. This is something that has been created for your convenience, so you don't have to go through the process of doing that each time. This is an object that exists but is empty, and one of its utilities is the following, that then I can pick it up, and now this object becomes my sort of center of symmetry, and if I move it around, I can use it to adjust my symmetry. And so this mirror right now no longer depends on where the pivot point of that specific object is, but it rather depends now from this empty. So that pretty much covers it for the mirror modifier, the Boolean modifier, and also for the screw modifier. We will be seeing more about empties in later videos, but so far, so good. And I'm excited because finally we are done. Now you have seen everything that came up in that major lecture. We have been reiterating through a lot of stuff. Hopefully now you have become kind of familiar with the techniques and tools of 3D modeling. And so we are now almost ready to start talking about things like lighting, procedural materials, and cinematic animations. Now, before we get into that, the next video will be the 25th in the series. And so it seems a very good point to make a first major review that kind of connects all the things that we have been reviewing. And hopefully it will help consolidate once and for all the knowledge that you have gained so far. And once again, congratulations for making it so far. We have covered so much ground in the last few videos. I know that not all of them have been tremendously exciting because it's rather technical stuff, but I think that a good metaphor is that this is like learning an instrument. At the beginning, it's very tedious, it's kind of frustrating, but then you get to play awesome music, and that's when it gets super rewarding. All right, cool. I'll wrap it up and I'll see you in the next video.